Okay, perfect. Okay, so what a pleasure to be here today among friends, colleagues, mentors. Well, Graham is not here today with us, but he's in the spirit. Although he already had listened to this presentation more than once, so yeah. I conducted my research. I want to share you about this. I conducted my research, and I'm speaking to you right now from the UBC Vancouver campus, and this is Musqueam Territories. Also about my positionality, I want to share with you that I am a Latin American mestiza woman, a first-generation immigrant, and I'm proud of myself and my daughters and determined to give back the opportunities and the privilege that I have enjoyed. The images that you're going to see in this presentation are mostly from artists from Mexico and from Bolivia, except from this photo that you're looking right now. It's a photo that was taken by my father, and what we're looking is the Guerrero province, the part of the world where in Mexico where he was raised. It's a small rural population, one of the poorest of the country, but also one of the most beautiful of the country, in my biased point of view. So I want to start this presentation by sharing with you my main driver to do my PhD. And this was to distance myself on my research from the idealization or the romantic view of human rights. Because in spite of undeniable achievements of human rights, they might pale when we compare them to an ideal scenario. I always hear, what are the function or the objective of human rights if there is still hunger in the world, if there's still torture, etc. And I believe they could be more easily, or fairly at least, compared when they are contrasted to a counterfactual scenario from before the human rights were recognized and upheld. For example, the right to food ultimate goal is to eradicate hunger, yet a more realistic and efficient approach would be to inquire whether the recognition of the human rights, or in this case, the right to food at the constitutional level, can boost progress towards that ideal goal. This is why my research focused is basically on empirically assessing the effectiveness of human rights. It explored practical implications at the national level of explicitly including the right to food into constitutions. And I found, and this is a spoiler alert, that the constitutional entrenchment of the right to food, it's an effective way to comprehensively address current food system challenges and advance their own rights realization. So assessing the influence of a constitutional right, it's a very complex issue because we would need to establish a cause and effect relationship from the entrenchment of the Constitution in the upper part of your screen to the right to food outcomes in the lower part of your screen. You can see that sequence of events. And this is complex because there are a myriad of variables that should be considered. For example, the rule of law, socioeconomic conditions, and for the case of the right to food, a country's food balance. Instead, I went for a more direct approach to determine first whether the constitutional right to food has been subsequently incorporated and that into core decisions, legislations, and policy, and that would be my first research question. And if that is the case, how have the branches of governments done so? How have they understand and developed the right to food? And what are the gaps and the failures that could reveal opportunities to improve the implementation of the right to food? And this was my second research question. So why do we need a constitutional entrenchment of human rights if we already have international human rights instruments, right? This is a question that stands at the core of my research and a question that I get asked every time I talk about these topics. Also, a question that could be asked in reverse. If a certain human right has been already recognized within the national legal system, for example, of the majority of the countries, why do we need universal recognition? This is the case, for example, for the human right to a healthy environment, which was recently recognized at the universal level just 3 years ago. So a quick answer to this is because one is not enough, we need them both. And I want to give you an example of this. So the human right to food was first recognized within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. 2 decades later, the right was further developed in the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And from now on, here and after, I will just mention the covenant, but I'm referring to the Social Covenant, adopted by the United Nations in 1966. And this covenant was ratified by 171 member states. This means that the majority of the countries of the world are obliged first, maximum of its available resources to progressively achieve the full realization of the right to food. Second, to immediately guarantee non-discrimination and non-regression in the exercise of the right to food. And third, to immediately meet the minimum essential of the right to food, which is, for the right to food, it's to be free from hunger. And if states do not comply with these obligations, there are international institutions, mechanisms, and procedures to make states accountable. This is fantastic, right? Yet, hungry people live in states that are party of the covenant. This is because ratification does not mean realization, just as the constitutional promises does not mean the implementation of the right and the achievement of its outcomes. What I just explained is portrayed in this map. Here in orange, countries that have not yet recognized the covenant. Then in different shades of blue, the countries that have ratified the covenant and therefore have a right to food obligation under international law. Darker blue are countries with severe food insecurity, and lighter blue countries are the ones that have no severe food insecurity or mild food insecurity. This could serve as an example of the limitation of international rights. But if we resist the ideal scenario that I was talking before, this also highlights the importance of discerning ways in which national legal systems, in partnership with international human rights law, could advance towards the elimination of hunger with equitable, environmental, and healthy parameters, which is the main objective of my research. Now, with respect to the content of the right to food, I would like to highlight that in 1966, I will go a little bit first within the history of the content, and then I will dive a little bit further on that. So in 1966, the Covenant understood the right to food mainly in relation with food availability. And this is not a surprise because these are the times of the Green Revolution, and the world is reaching its democratic peak. A couple of decades later, Amartya Sen published Poverty and Famine, which contains one of my favorite quotes in the world of the right to food. He said, "The law stands between food availability and the individual." And he was highlighting that the fight against hunger cannot advance until the legal systems recognize individuals' entitlement to food. In this context, the right to food reappeared as a promising tool in the 1996 World Summit of Food Security, when member states asked for a better definition because at that time the right to food was not well understood. So they triggered the drafting of a landmark document that explained the content and the scope of the right to food. And I'm talking about the General Comment 12, which was drafted by the United Nations Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1999. The General Comment 12 served, by the way, this document served as a foundation, and not only for my for this chapter of my thesis, which I'm talking about the content, but also for my analytical framework. So the General Comment 12 achieved very important things. One of them, it recognized tensions between availability and accessibility, and established that both concepts are at the core of the right to food. And then it clarified other fundamental aspects of the right to food that would assist in confront hunger and other challenges. For example, it established a more detailed obligation of the state, because states are obliged to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to food, and also a more sophisticated substantive and procedural content. And I would like to stop a little bit here just to go a little bit more in detail on the substantive content on the right to food, because I think particularly for the Global Solidarity Alliance, this is crucial. I will put my glasses because now I'm in that part of my life that I need glasses. And I want to quote some things because it's a very important content. So when state is obliged with respect to the right to food with regards to accessibility, it is its obligation to primarily provide conditions that enable all individuals to acquire adequate food, to feed themselves, either by physically producing food and/or economically purchasing food. In this case, individuals will need adequate income either from employment and self-employment and/or social transfers and social services. Alternatively, and I'm going to highlight alternatively, if individuals are unable to feed themselves, the state has an obligation to provide them with food, adequate food, to ensure they are free from hunger. This obligation is of immediate effect because it is inscribed within the state's duty to provide the minimum essential level of the right to food, which is to be free from hunger, as I mentioned earlier, with no discrimination and no regression. Individuals in this case would need access to food provision in public programs targeting, for example, food insecure children, victims of disaster or conflict, populations in detention, migrants, refugees, etc. This public provision of food is not a favor, it is a right, an entitlement that is guaranteed in legislation and policy, and if denied, could be claimed in form of the judiciary and enforced. Also, I want to comment about the procedural content of the right to food, just barely because it's very important and the General Comment 12 also talks about it. So the right to food has this procedural right, and I'm talking about the access to information, access to public participation processes, and access to justice. And these are very important toolkit that helps the realization of the right to food. So now into the selection of countries. So in order to determine which of the 30 countries that have already included the right to food in the Constitution could be best example to be further analyzed, I perform a 3-step selection process. And I just want to stop a little bit here just to mention that originally at the beginning of my PhD, I was hoping to study the 30 countries, but Graham and my other supervisors highlight that that was not possible for the PhD. So they told me, why don't you do just 1 or maybe 2 countries? So at the end, that's what I did. But yeah, this research could be further expanded to analyze the other remaining countries. So the first step in this 3-step selection process was to discard fragile states. And that was important because in these states, the rule of law is so weak that it is very unlikely that the right to food would be implemented and, if needed, enforced. For the remaining 22 countries, I conducted research to establish, number 1, inclusion years, and number 2, the precise wording of the constitutional provision. And this will give me a baseline to conduct further analysis. Here I present the timeline for the constitutional entrenchment of the right to food around the world. Each constitution contains a wide variety of wording within the right to food provisions. And if you're more interested, I can talk to you on other occasions about this topic because it's fascinating on how different parts of the world recognize the right to food. Costa Rica was the first one in 1948 and Fiji the last one in 2013. Now, for the final step of my selection of countries, I conduct qualitative and quantitative analysis. With respect to the quantitative analysis, I looked for countries that have experienced a positive correlation between the right to food constitutional inclusion and food security metrics. For example, what you're seeing here in the slide is prevalence of undernourishment analysis, where Bolivia, in light blue, is the country that experienced a faster rate of change after the constitutional inclusion. I want to highlight that this is correlation, it's not causality. For the qualitative analysis, I assess the wording of right to food constitution provisions, and from law point of view, I selected the stronger ones because stronger provisions are more likely to be implemented and enforced. The outcome of this selection analysis indicated that Bolivia and Mexico were very relevant cases, and from this point of my research and after, I conducted a case studies analysis on these two countries. These countries where the right to food implementations efforts were searched for and assessed under the analytical framework that was founded in the General Comment 12 that I just mentioned. So now, let me see how we are on time. Okay, now into the results. I will go about this quickly, but I could go further if anyone has questions after this or at other session. So the first step was to research enforceability, because this is a prerequisite for implementation. And I found that both countries have a constitutional right to food that is self-executing, and it has high enforceable potential. I also found that the explicit constitutional entrenchment of the right to food is very important. It matters because it triggers actions that have implemented the right to food. In the case of Mexico, 7 laws, 5 policies, and 5 court decisions are implemented the right to food, and in the case of Bolivia, 4 laws, 6 policies, and 3 court decisions. I also found that both countries possess a comprehensive understanding of the right to food. First of all, they clarified operational parameters by establishing clear sources of entitlement. This improved remedy, of course, and this also gives direction to the whole administration to deliver on the promises. Not only administration, but also the other branches of government to deliver the promises of the Constitution. For example, the Bolivia Constitutional Court established that allocating public funds to implement the right to food is not an option, but a state obligation. Second, just as the General Comment 12 recognized food accessibility and availability concepts, the right to food implementations efforts in both countries do the same. And they require authorities to intervene, and this is very important. None of the right to food implementation efforts, this is none of its policies, law, and court decisions support the food charity model, none of them. Efforts in these two countries determine that the state is obliged to provide individuals with means to purchase and or produce food, and when individuals are not able to feed themselves, the state has an obligation to provide them access to public food provisioning programs. This doesn't mean that the food charity model doesn't exist in these countries. It just means that it's not supported at this point to laws that are implementing the right to food policies and court decisions as well. All 3 adequacy dimensions were addressed. Health dimensions, for example, were least considered. Yes, yet there are some advances there. For example, citing the right to food, Mexican Supreme Court upheld amendments to a Mexican tax law that imposed an 8% tax on sales and imports to unhealthy food. All the 6 aspects of the environmental dimension were considered, and the social dimensions were extensively considered for an array of different marginalized population, cultural acceptability, and education as well. Finally, complementary yet fundamental topics are also regarded. For example, affirmation of procedural rights, regulation of businesses, interdependent nature of rights, and the coordination among laws and authorities. Despite these positive developments, we found that there are legal gaps and systemic implementation challenges that undermine the potential of the right to food. The legal gaps include, for example, food loss and waste was completely neglected for both countries. While a wide range of vulnerable populations were considered in both countries, populations in detentions, victims of conflicts, and food system workers were completely overlooked. Gender equality was poorly addressed in both countries. For example, in contrast with other objectives of the Bolivian Agricultural Plan, none of the gender equity objectives were further developed into specific actions or programs. One of these gender objectives established that women should have access to financial services. Yet, the agrarian insurance program, created in the very same agricultural plan, does not contain any gender approach. Businesses related topics remained also a need to be more extensively regulated. For example, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, the Bolivia Constitutional Court determined that the right of businesses supersede the right to food and the right to water. Right to food defenders protection was also neglected, particularly relevant in Mexico. This is because in Mexico is sadly one of the deadliest countries to be a human rights defender or a journalist. With respect to systemic challenges, both states suffer from a most debilitating space between what it is promised in the Constitution and what it is delivered. I'm referring to policies that are left into oblivion, framework laws that are never enacted, and court decisions that are simply not obeyed. For example, Bolivia 2014 food policy established the creation of monitoring and implementation agencies for the food policy. Yet, I did not find any evidence that these agencies are being created yet. These kinds of challenges have been regarded for many scholars as the next generation to conquer in the human rights fulfillment efforts. Finally, the Mexican and the Bolivian case studies could not be generalized, yet there have similarities that could serve as a collaboration opportunities among these countries, but also that could guide other countries. One of them is that court decisions in both countries have advanced right to food fulfillment efforts, for example, by expanding and upholding the right to food. However, none of the right to food cases have been brought by or on behalf of vulnerable populations that are hungry or undernourished, and none of them have ordered authorities or businesses to carry out specific activities which refers to unfulfilled obligations or responsibilities. The school food program in both countries exemplifies the benefits of entrenching the right to food at the constitutional level. The state apparatus functions as a well-oiled machine to serve rights, allowing a congruent development from broad rights to defined obligations. For example, in the case of Bolivia, the constitution contains a powerful but rather general statement. It says, everybody has the right to food, the state shall guarantee it. This serves as the legal foundation for the school food law, which developed a more detailed instruction. The school food law says, every children attending the school will be provided with adequate food. This law is then translated into specific duties within the school food program, which determine that provincial and municipal authorities must coordinate to build 10,000 school cafeterias with a budget of 40 million to provide adequate food for students. Other right to food policies in Bolivia develop additional aspects of the school food program, making sure it remains a priority for the whole government. In Mexico, the three branches of government had worked to strengthen the right to food of Mexican school children. First, the legislature amended the federal education law to lay foundation for a school food provisioning policy. Then, the executive created a school breakfast program, a policy that provides food to food insecure children at school. And finally, the Mexican Supreme Court first upheld the constitutional amendments done by the legislature to the federal education law and later extended the beneficiaries to include indigenous populations. As we can see in these two countries, the wheels of the legal systems are turning. Yet these are not the only metrics by which success of the right to food should be measured. These legal developments are means to an end, and the end is the full enjoyment by all people of all universally recognized human rights. This is why I think it is very important to continue developing this kind of academic efforts that assess the impacts of the implementation of human rights. Ta-da! Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Laura. That was lovely. we have some time for questions and discussion if anybody wants to offer something up.
Let me just, yes. I could stop sharing so that we can see each other. Let me just.
I actually have a question about the right to food map you had up there with the
Oh, sure. Let me
different
go.
shades of blue and just thinking about this um, global solidarity alliance that's trying to kind of disrupt that idea that food insecurity does not exist in those light blue shades.
Mm,
Um, no severe food insecurity,
yes.
but especially we're seeing more and more, non-measured forms of food insecurity in these countries. And yeah, my thought was, thinking about the early focus of this group in responding to this narrative that, well, that doesn't happen in the global north. So even though
Mhm.
we signed on to this thing, it's not really applicable to us in the same ways. So I just wonder if you could comment out the
Yes.
data that makes up that map a little more.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for pointing that out, Josh. Yes. The data come from the FAO-FAIES and other data that the FAO has of with respect to undernourishment, also, and food insecurity, which I think Janet Poppen said that this was an euphemism for hunger. And yes, so one of the big difficulties with this data is that, for example, in the case of the FAO, they stop measuring when less than 2.5% of the population is food insecure. So that's that's a very dangerous way to provide data, because the message that it conveys is that if you are part of that less than 2.5% of the population, then you have no rights, or at least you have no right to be measured that you are experiencing hunger. And right now I'm actually with a project that we are trying to look for all this data around the world that does not have a human rights approach. And FAO, it's a good case of that. So yes, even in this map that you're seeing, what it means in the blue light part is countries that have no severe food insecurity is that they are less than 2.5% of the population experience no severe insecurity. But that doesn't mean that there is food insecurity, because they parted in levels, so right. So that doesn't mean that there is food insecurity, because in these light countries there is food insecurity, and there is also severe food insecurity in less than 2.5%, which are also individuals with human rights and individuals with the right to food.
Thank you, Laura. Um, Chelsea has a follow-up question.
Hi, and thank you, Dr. Laura, for your presentation. Um, so I'm speaking on behalf of someone in the United States. I live in Virginia, and so I'm speaking from that context. Um, and we are anticipating some pretty significant shifts, I think, in US food justice policy under new leadership across several different health related agencies, health and human services, and then our research institutions that deal with health related topics. So I'm curious to how in your context, in your setting, how do you navigate challenges or pushback to your stance on the right to food? And what strategies have been most effective in advancing this conversation?
Mm. Um, Chelsea, I want to clarify about your question. So, are you referring to mm, like my contents in terms of me living in Canada, or my research with respect to Latin American countries, or in general, are you referring to ways in which countries around the world could further advance the right to food realization strategies.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. Honestly, if you could speak to either of those points, I think it'd be great learning for me and maybe others in the room.
Yes, well, thank you for that. Well, after conducting my studies, I realized that, of course, the inclusion of the right to food at different levels of the national legal system is crucial. Either constitutions, and this is not always an easy case for different parts of the world because they have different ways to amend constitutions, and sometimes it's more easy than in some countries than others, which could be very difficult to amend a constitution. But that doesn't mean that in other parts, at other levels of the legal system, the right to food and other social rights could be included. And we have the good example in the States with regards to it, even though at the constitutional level the United States does not recognize the right to food, there are some states that, and there is a trend now that some states are recognizing the right to food at the constitutional level, and Josh and Alison can tell us about this, but this is a very positive trend. But also what we have been seeing is that it doesn't have to be necessarily in constitution. This is ideal because of the way the hierarchy of the law functions in most parts of the world. But that could be also the case for the inclusion of the right to food in laws and policies and core decisions. And that's what we have been seeing also. So, for example, some in other parts of the world could be more easy or more strategically feasible to go in front of a judge. For example, for a vulnerable population to go and partner with an NGO and present a case of the right to food in front of a court, of a judge, and sometimes the judges would be amenable to said something about a certain case of. I'm thinking of I'm thinking of ways in which judges around the world can help the realization of the right to food by accepting court cases regarding the right to food, even though the right to food is not included in the Constitution. And this is because, and in most of my experience, what they do is that judges around the world, they cite the universal human right to food from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also from the International Covenant of Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights. So as you can see in the map, most of the countries around the world have been a state party of the covenant. And most of the judges in the world have used this tool to said that the right to food is there for an individual to be to be an enforceable right. So that is the case for the judges. So strategically, I would say try to amend the Constitution, try to include the right to food in law and policies, or go and organize to go in front of a judge so that the judge could adjudicate in the best ideal scenario, so that the judge could adjudicate the case and make precedent about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Melanie, I think you were next for a question.
You. Oh, it might be a bit windy. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was super interesting. I guess I just wonder how much you think Mexico and other countries who have kind of committed to this, who have a very deeply entrenched connection to food within their culture and identity, influence them actually choosing to make these commitments.
Sorry, Melanie, at the end, I didn't get you. So you were mentioning how Mexico has this connection with food culture, you mentioned?
So it has a very deeply entrenched connection to food within its culture and identity. And from someone who grew up in Greece with the same kind of feeling, but now lives in England where maybe the food culture isn't so deep, or at least so kind of driven on equality, how does Mexico's culture influence the country wanting to commit to like this right to food?
Mm. Thank you. I didn't conduct analysis on a specific that question, but I can answer you from my experience. So yes, just as you mentioned, Mexico has a deeply relationship with food and food culture. And that is recognized by the adequacy component of the right to food. Um, uh, the right to food means that we all have right to adequate food, not any kind of food. And adequate food could be understood as food that is healthy, food that is environmentally sustainable, and food that is socially just. And part of that social component of the adequacy element, it's the cultural appropriacy. It's very important. So in my experience with Mexico, I didn't see that in the debates in the Congress to include the right to food, and also in the law and policy. I mean, in the law, there's some reference to cultural appropriacy, so that's there. But I think the main driver for Mexico including the right to food in the constitutions and in other laws was poverty and hunger. I think that was the main driver, even though for sure the cultural appropriacy it's a very important part of Mexico, and we can see that part in at least a couple of policies and I think one or two laws.
Thank you, Laura. Alana?
Hi, thank you. That was a really great presentation. You mentioned that neither Mexico or Bolivia incorporated food loss or waste into their approach. And I was wondering, with some of the other conversations we've had in this group, oftentimes that has been putting forth a charity approach. So I was wondering if in your analysis of other countries, you saw ways that food loss and food waste were incorporated that did support a right to food, or if you think like that's maybe actually a benefit towards it being a right to food enactment.
Yes, so I didn't look in depth into any other of the countries. I only looked in depth into Mexico and Bolivia, as in food lost and waste was neglected. But unfortunately, the way I have seen food lost and waste has been developed in some countries, especially, for example, France and recently Spain, Italy, I think as well, is that they have this law in which I think Andy Fisher and Alison mentioned something recently about the law in Spain that was approved in I think just a couple of weeks from now, and I had the opportunity to review that law, and basically what they are saying is they are asking the supermarkets to give all their food waste to charity and food banks. So the way instead of making in the case of Spain, it's a little bit different from the case in France, because they do mention that the first tier would be for supermarkets and other entities throughout the food chain supply to rethink about food waste and loss and to incorporate that into the food chain. So that's the first tier. But the second tier would be to give the waste, food waste or surplus food to human consumption through food banks. So unfortunately, we can see that trend. And yes, I don't know if I respond your question, but I haven't looked into detail on this on a comparative study on food waste and loss around the world, but definitely the case of France and the case of Spain it's something that it needs to be further analyzed.
Thank you so much, Laura. I've been hearing about your PhD in the works for several years now, so it's really exciting to see the presentation and the results of your work, and congratulations. I know it's quite an accomplishment. My question has to do with the strength of civil society in these countries and or civil society organizations. And I'm wondering, if that was included in your study at all in terms of for me, it's very heartening to hear that having a constitutional amendment is a really strong indicator that that the right to food can be progressively realized. And I'm wondering about the, you know, the tension and the balance, necessary tension and the balance between the state and the people and the citizens. And so, did you look at all in Bolivia and Mexico at sort of the strength of folks at the civil society level in terms of their organizing, in terms of their movement building, et cetera?
Thank you, Alison. I agree with you that this the strength of civil society is crucial. For my research, I didn't look into that. I mainly looked into legal documents, and I didn't go further into that. But definitely, it's something that needs to be further analyzed. I know there are some studies over there that looked into that. I haven't looked into in detail in those researches, but yes, it's crucial because, as I mentioned, if and this is related to a question that I was answering before this, which is what are the best strategies to advance the right to food realization or right to food movement, and this has to do with the strength of civil society. So I didn't look into that, but what we have seen also in this in my research is that access to information, public participation processes, and access to justice as procedural rights are crucial, and that those procedural rights are very important to strengthen civil society. So when we have seen countries around the world that have good access to information, that there is a transparency, that there are institutions that are implementing the access to information and making sure the state is sharing information with the public, and also in those countries where public participation to public decision making is granted, definitely in those countries civil societies get stronger, they get more informed, and the result is in general the strengthening of human rights in that community or country.
Thank you so much, Laura. We are at time, and I also just want to thank Graham, who joined us, for all his mentorship and cracking these questions open as well. This call is recorded, so I'm going to send it back out to the listserv, and feel free to share it among your networks if you think it would be relevant. I also love that we have a lawyer as part of our group here, even in these times where law seems to be quite porous. It's an analysis that's so important. So thank you for all the work over these years to analyze the legal framework at this scale. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you, and I will stop.
Can I just say something before you do?
Yes, please.
Oh,
Yeah,
Graham,
sorry,
there
I
you
was late arriving. My computer is aging, and trying to get it moving in the morning is difficult. I just want to, really thank Laura for the thesis and the work and all the energy and time and intellect actually that's been put into it. It's been fantastic to see, and to have you here actually presenting to the group, I think is a major significant accomplishment. And I think one of the things actually which your presentation and the indicates to me is that when we're talking about severe food insecurity, we probably should do a little bit of work, or somebody should, in actually getting all these definitions cleared up. The FAO definition, the USDA definition, the Canadian StatsCan and proof definition, and Europe, because I think there's a sort of can be then misunderstandings about what we're actually talking about. When you look at the map, okay, I think maybe a sort of a rethink of the map in terms of taking different definitions into account, because I think global north, global south, I mean, there are different kinds of issues and clearly problems if you think about, you know, the disasters going on in the world all around us. Anyway, but thank you very much. Anyway, great, brilliant to see you. Yeah. Cheers. Thanks, Josh. Yeah.
Thank you, Graham.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Graham, and thank you for being my mentor and my inspiration through all the process. It was my greatest pleasure to learn from you, and yes, I'm just very grateful to life for put you in my life. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So.